watching Veracity Hill. Here is your host, Dr. J.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining me here for another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on Bart Ehrman's book, How Jesus Became God. We're starting a new sub-series, if you will, here at Veracity Hill, where I will be reading through and talking about each chapter in Bart Ehrman's 2014 book, How Jesus Became God, the exaltation of a Jewish preacher from Galilee. So Ehrman is not a Christian, and so he has, as a non-Christian, had to think about how is it that the early Christians came to believe that Jesus was God? What was that thought process like? And so Ehrman has written out a case for that. So we're going to analyze his case over the next couple months. Each week I'll be looking at a chapter. Today we begin with chapter 1. But before we get there, I just have a couple announcements. You might be interested to join me on the second and fourth Tuesday of each month for the Veracity Hill Book Club. We've got a nice little book club logo there. It's the Veracity Hill Book Club logo. And we will be launching our usual book club times a little late this year. September was kind of busy. We're starting in October, the second Tuesday in October. Perspectives on Paul, 5 views. In this book there are, there's going to be a Roman Catholic view, traditional Protestant, new perspective on Paul, and 2 others. I haven't read the book, so I don't know what's coming. That's the fun of book club. And it's a time for some of us who are local in the western suburbs of Chicago to get together for just about an hour and a half on it's about an hour and a half, 90 minutes on the second and fourth Tuesday of each month. We also have a 360 camera, so if you do not live in Chicagoland and you want to join for the discussion, yes, the digital virtual option's not as conducive to discussion as being in person, but nevertheless, you might have some questions, or you might just want to be a fly on the wall and join us as we discuss the book. We are again starting that this second Tuesday of October. I forget which date that is. But if you wanted more information, you can sign up for the Veracity Hill newsletter by going to veracityhill.com, and in the navigation menu, there should be an option for newsletter. If you're on mobile, there might be the 3 buttons. Just click around, you'll find it. Find the newsletter option, and there's a book club option, and we're sending out an e-blast to everybody with more details on that, with the link for the virtual if you are not local to Chicago. If you've got any other questions, feel free just to contact me at veracityhill.com. I'd love to have you join us for the book club. It's low commitment. It's basically like, a chapter every other week. Very low commitment. And less of a commitment than even what we're starting with today, reading through this book, Bart Ehrman's book. But before we get there, one more announcement. We, for a few more weeks, have this $10,000 challenge match by the board of directors from Defenders Media. And so if you have enjoyed the content coming from Veracity Hill, please consider making a one-time contribution, or I would love to have you join on my monthly partnership team. So your support helps to sustain the ministry efforts here at Veracity Hill, and it will also help us to reach more people online. You might even designate your funds, for example, to go for advertising if you specifically wanted to help our videos reach more people. I'd be happy to have your funds be used in that way. So please consider supporting this ministry work. Okay, so here's the book. It's Ehrman's How Jesus Became God. There we go. There's a little picture. I did want to share a quote from an evangelical scholar. We've got Nick Quint, who's joined us in the live stream. Great to have you, Nick, there in the live chat. Glad you're watching today. Also, yes, I've got my cut. Nick reminded me because he's a baseball fan. I've got my Cubs hat on today because, as you may know, I'm a big Chicago Cubs fan. There are some pennants I have up on the wall there when they won the World Series in 2016. And it's playoff baseball. Today is the start of the 2025 postseason for Major League Baseball, and the Cubs are in the wild card round. They're playing the San Diego Padres, which is the beloved team of my friend Dante Stack. So we weren't on all the best speaking terms at today's team meeting at Defenders Media. I'm just kidding. It was just fine, but One of us has to lose, of course. I'm rooting for the Cubbies, and first pitch probably already happened, so I might keep tabs on the score if I refresh my ESPN scoreboard. Let's see here. Yes, first pitch has happened, and so it'll be hard to track that and, of course, talk. But I'm wearing the Cubs hat today because I'm showing my Cubby pride, and also the glasses are going to become a regular staple on the program, especially as I'm going to be looking at small text each week now. So this quote from Mark Strauss. He's the author of 4 Portraits, 1 Jesus, a survey of Jesus in the Gospels. I want to remind you that the way many non-Christian scholars approach the Gospels is this way that he describes. Strauss writes, "Many critical scholars do not consider the Gospels to be eyewitness accounts. They are rather the result of a long process of creative storytelling and myth-making by communities far removed in place and time from the historical Jesus." So again, he's describing what many critical scholars, and you might even say here many non-Christian critical scholars, one might call themselves a critical scholar yet believe what is the text says is true, versus it being like a myth or theological development or so on and so forth. This is where I see Ehrman is heading with the purpose of his book. So again, let's take a step back here, looking at these trends. This figure, this chart comes from Strauss's book, I believe, if I remember correctly. And for the vast majority of the Common Era, CE, you have this traditional approach at the top that the Gospels as inspired and historical accounts of Jesus' life. But then you get sort of, as I a few weeks back talked about, you have through the Enlightenment this growing skepticism of what the Gospels were presenting. And so you have these quests for the historical Jesus. And we are now at the bottom there in this third quest where there are diverse methods and approaches. And in that box, in that third quest, you have both the liberals and the conservative scholars. Because whilst the first and second quest were going on, essentially you had conservatives rejecting the historical critical method, instead just to, as Strauss writes there, continue to assert and defend the reliability of the Gospels. So now what you have a branch of the conservatives, people who are Orthodox Christians, that implement and agree with the methodology of the historical critical method. Now, I'm not, formally speaking, a New Testament scholar, but I'm sympathetic to the historical critical method. I have no problem with it. I think we can employ this method and come to the same conclusions that Christians have come to for centuries. So I'm happy to live and swim in the third quest and argue for a way of understanding the Gospels that's wholly compatible with what Christians have believed throughout the centuries. So that gives you the big overview of where we are at in this third quest. We're still there swimming in those waters, and we're going to engage with a liberal scholar on this chart, theologically liberal. This is not politically conservative or politically liberal, but theologically. And let's jump into Ehrman's book. Let me show you a new toy. Well, you won't see the new toy because you'll see what the new toy shows. I got this little book reader, so you might see my desk if it's up there, and I'm going to spin around myself, and I'm going to even have to move my laptop here so I can keep tabs on any comments that may or may not roll through. All right, so here we've got the book, and you might see this frame quite a bit over the following weeks because we're going to read through, not quite read through, a read along or a read through. I'm not going to read everything, and I want to talk about the introduction and chapter 1. And I've made some highlights and some comments. So I might, talk about that paragraph. I might read that paragraph to give you some context. And we will focus here on what we can see on the screen. Okay, so we've got this introduction, and Bart talks about how he used to be a Christian. He used to believe this, and he had a friend that also is a Christian that he mentioned in this introduction. And I wanted to talk about here some of the way he's phrased some things. Really, I could see the rhetorical flair, but also some non sequiturs that sort of come out in his writing. And so I might have to zoom this in. Hopefully it'll work, but I'll read for you here. I'm just on page 2 here in this introduction. And he writes here, I'll read the paragraph. "But I had changed over the years, and now in middle age I am no longer a believer. Instead, I am a historian of early Christianity who, for nearly 3 decades, has studied the New Testament and the rise of the Christian religion from a historical perspective. And now my question, in some ways, is the precise opposite of my friends. As a historian, I am no longer obsessed with the theological question of how God became a man, but with the historical question of how a man became God." So you see here that he's looking at this perspective now from 2 different things, right? It's no longer a theological query, it's a historical query. And he sort of inverted it. It's not about, how is it that God can become a man, but a man could become God? So why is that highlighted? Well, on the very next page, this paragraph right here, and I know I might have to zoom in a little bit on the camera. Maybe it's good enough here. Top of 3, "In this book I have tried to approach this question in a new way that will be useful not only for secular historians of religion like me, but also for believers like my friend who continue to think that Jesus is in fact God. As a result, I do not take a stand on the theological question of Jesus' divine status. I am instead interested in the historical development that led to the affirmation that he is God. This historical development certainly transpired in one way or another, and what people personally believe about Christ should not, in theory, affect the conclusions they draw historically." Well, I don't think that's quite right, because there's a way of starting your journey, and maybe I'll turn here and speak to you, my friends. There's a way of starting this journey that already has assumptions built in. So one of the assumptions here is when Ehrman writes that this historical question is how a man could become God. Now, is he explicitly saying a mere man? No, but I think that's being implied here. Because to him, it's peculiar that Jesus is not thought of as divine from the get-go or all along, but rather the starting point for Ehrman is that Jesus is a mere man who becomes divine in the mind of his followers. So even the way he phrased this, that a man become God, at least historically speaking, this would be adoptionism, the heresy of adoptionism, this idea that Jesus was just a man and then became divine. And so you already see here that this is not neutral ground that he's trying to craft here. It's already baked into the way he's phrased his project. So in this regard, it's not from a ground of neutrality, which I don't know if you can be neutral, but the point here is that he's trying to be neutral on page 3 when he says, "I do not take a stand on the theological question," but I think it's clear that he already has. So that was the one thing that I wanted to talk about from the introduction. There's a few other points that are worth mentioning just so we can get a better understanding of where he's at. I've tried my best to kind of color code my own. You can see I've already got orange and green and yellow highlights. I have my own little system. And so yellow would be sort of just data points that are worth absorbing. They're not necessarily logical steps that Ehrman is trying to provide for us. He's not trying to make an assertion or push us one way. They're just kind of matter of fact. So here's one on top to middle of 5. "One of my theses will be that a Christian text, such as the Gospel of Mark, understands Jesus in the first way as a human who came to be made divine. The Gospel of John understands him in the second way, as a divine being who became human. Both of them see Jesus as divine, but in different ways. Isn't that interesting? What did he just write? I do not take a stand on the theological question of Jesus' divine status. And then he's making a claim already that Mark and John have a disagreement in their Christology. So they both see Jesus as divine, but in different ways. There's already a division that Ehrman has proposed between the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John. Again, he's only going to be neutral for oh so long, maybe 2 pages. Moreover, did he talk about himself as a divine being? Ehrman writes, I will argue that he did not. Now, I take big issue with this. It's in yellow because this is simply Bart describing his views, not telling us what we should believe, or I don't think it's rhetorical flair, or it's not just, a part of his argument that he's trying to push here. He's just telling us his view. Again, this is sort of a quick just data set here. But again, this idea of neutrality, I mean, come on. He doesn't take the stand on the theological question of Jesus' divine status, but he's already claiming Jesus never spoke of himself as divine, and I just do not agree with him there. I don't agree with him certainly regarding the Gospel of John. I don't agree with him either regarding his interpretation of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, or Luke. So that's the introduction. That's just what I wanted to say from there. See, again, it's not quite a read-through. It's not a read-along. But I wanted to walk through the text here so that if you wanted to read along with me, I'd be happy to engage your comments. If you've got questions about what we're reading together in the live stream, we can review these together. So, chapter 1, here we go. Now we're really rolling. Divine humans in ancient Greece and Rome. So, Ehrman starts off this chapter, and I admit he got me at the start before I picked up on what he was doing. Here's what he does. He says, when he's teaching his New Testament intro course at UNC Chapel Hill, he says, is it best to start with our earliest author of the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, who wrote more of the books of the New Testament than any other author? Or is it best to start with the Gospels, which, while written after Paul, discuss the life of Jesus, who lived before Paul wrote his letters? In the end, I tell them that probably it's best to begin by telling the story of a highly unusual man who was born in the 1st century in a remote part of the Roman Empire, whose life was described by his later followers as altogether miraculous. Wow, sounds like Jesus, right? We don't need to start with Paul. We don't need to start with the Gospels. Let's start by telling this story of this historical Jesus. Well, that's how he baits you, because then he goes on to describe the details of this person, but then you'll see here that he's actually talking about Apollonius of Tyana. So he draws these parallels between this historical figure, Apollonius, and I'm not going to go through all these comparisons, but essentially he wants the reader to come away with realizing that there are these parallels, and the implication is strongly that this is copycat material, and that the implication is, maybe the early Christians drew upon what other people thought of regarding human divine beings, how humans could become divine beings. Now he's going to get into that a little later, but this is clearly the parallels he's trying to draw. For our purposes, I think it's very important to note that the dating of, I'm going to mispronounce these names, these ancient names, Philostratus's book, who wrote about Apollonius, is later than Jesus of Nazareth. It's later. So in terms of an argument of like the copycat, the question that we're going to ask ourselves is, who copied whom? And given that Jesus is a 1st century figure, and that the writings about Jesus come from the 1st century, that's the key, that the writings are much closer to the time of Jesus than Philostratus's book is to Apollonius's life. There's a much stronger case to be made that, the Gospels are different and Paul's writings are different. Now, he does try to analyze and look at these legendary, drawing this contrast between the historical and the legendary Apollonius. And I see that's a little... Let's see if I can autofocus by pushing the button, if that helps. Maybe that helps a little bit. There we go. I saw that Apollonius right there. I've got a new toy, and I'm trying to learn how it works. I think that did the trick. Okay, so that's how Ehrman's going to... He's going to describe Apollonius' life in detail and talk about Philostratus' work. And then he starts comparing. And what you see here on page 17, you already get a flavor for the way he interprets historical events. So there's this debate between Heracles and Eusebius over who's, the historical, who's the true Messiah figure. Heracles says, that Jesus and his works were vamped up by Peter and Paul, and Eusebius kind of puts him down. But here's what's interesting again. If this little debate, Ehrman writes, is looked at from a historical perspective, there can be little doubt that Eusebius ended up winning. But that would not have been a foregone conclusion when Heracles wrote his book before Christianity had become more powerful. You see here, you get this classic trope of the winners write the history books, which is certainly not always the case. But also, it implies that the winners, this trope that the winners write the history book, implies that the winners are so biased that we cannot discover the truth, or that worse, that the truth is nowhere to be found in those books. And so, that's just the winners, this and that. It's sort of dismissive or reductionistic instead of actually dealing with the arguments. As a critical thinker, I like to deal with the arguments, to think critically about whether the argument being presented is valid, if there's an unwarranted assumption, if there's a logical misstep, what the inference ought to be, so on and so forth. We want to deal with the arguments, not merely dismiss a source. You don't want to shoot the messenger. Eusebius, he's only seen as victorious because Christianity was more powerful. I really think this is rhetorically nice, maybe, but in terms of helping us best understand, who is right between them, you might say, they're both wrong, but you wouldn't want to say it's because Christianity became more powerful. All right, so here we are. Let's get him back here. Let's look at these three models of the divine human. And before we go step by step, so Ehrman says that there are three models here. The first one, I've noted in the outline, there are gods who temporarily become human. There are divine beings born of a god and immortal. And then you have a human who becomes divine. So three types, three models for this divine human. Now, let me read here since I've got some orange you can see. Christianity arose in the Roman Empire immediately after the death of Jesus around the year 30 CE. Common era, let's just go with AD, in the year of our Lord. He's my Lord, so I'll say 30 AD. The eastern half of the empire was thoroughly infused with Greek culture, so much so that the common language of the Eastern Empire, the language in fact in which the entire New Testament was written, was Greek. And so to understand the views of the early Christians, we need to situate them in their historical and cultural contexts, which means in the Greek and Roman worlds. Jews of the time had many distinctive views of their own. See the next chapter. But in many key respects of concern for our study, they shared, in their own ways, many of the views of their Roman friends and neighbors. This is important to know because Jesus himself was a Jew, as were his immediate followers, including the ones who first proclaimed that he was not a mere mortal, but was actually God. Okay, why is this important? First, when we talked about the quest for the historical Jesus, recall that one of the features to the third quest was recovering Jesus' Jewishness. And so it's nice to see that Bart has done that here. He's talking about how Jesus is a Jew, and we need to situate him in his world. That's a very good method. Let us situate Jesus in his own world. The problem I have for that is that Ehrman has claimed that the Jews shared with the Greeks and the Romans many views. Now, what were those views? What were the views? Guess what? You don't know, because this is something that Ehrman just asserts. He just claims it as matter of fact, and you wouldn't know what those common views are. And in fact, you're going to see even Bart throughout the rest of this first chapter, you're going to see him talk about how it was that the Jews were in fact different. For example, they weren't polytheists. They were, at this time, monotheists. Well, that's a huge difference if you are thinking that this Jesus guy is in fact God. That's a lot different on the Jewish conception, monotheism, than polytheism, where you have a pantheon of gods and you've got the emperor cult. So, for him to claim this idea that they held to the same view, many of the same views as their Roman friends and neighbors, I mean, that just, again, he sort of snuck it in there and then didn't do anything to support it. So, that was the first thing that stuck out to me as kind of a big red flag, because as Bart's going to go through this here, he's going to describe these different figures. So gods who temporarily become human, Jupiter and Mercury make a visit to elderly peasants. There's a story in a poet, Ovid, and they basically make Philemon and Bacchus these temple guards. And so why is this relevant? Well, one thing that I learned from this, so this is a positive point from Ehrman's studies, is that this occurs in the town, according to Ovid, that it occurs in the town of Lystra, which we encounter in the book of Acts. And so this actually makes sense now. It's given me a greater cultural understanding, sort of Bible backgrounds of the event in Acts 14, when the locals believe that Paul and Barnabas are the incarnations of Zeus and Hermes. So because that's the counterpart to Jupiter and Mercury. So he writes, the people in Lystra know the tale of Philemon and Bacchus and think that the two gods have appeared once again in their midst. So that's neat. I really appreciated learning that from Bart. I hadn't taken the time to study more in depth that event, that narrative in Acts. I assume Craig Keener would have made some mention to it, since Keener is like just a beast. So it was cool getting the Bible backgrounds there. But here's what's interesting. Then Ehrman gives his little take. So let's start at the bottom of 21 if you're following along with me. It is no wonder these worshippers of Zeus at Lystra were so eager to recognize that the gods temporarily become human among them. They remembered well what happened another time. They refused to offer worship where worship was due. Whether the story in Acts is a historical recollection of Paul's missionary activities, or simply an intriguing legend that sprang up in later times, like the story of Philemon and Bacchus itself, is immaterial for our consideration here. In the Roman world, it was widely thought that gods could take on human guise, such that some of the people one might meet on occasion may well indeed be divine. Okay, here's why I'm taking umbrage here. Because, yes, Ehrman says, well, it's sort of immaterial for our consideration here. But I don't want him to have this so easy. And I'm going to use this opportunity to also zoom in on the text here, since I'm seeing that's a little distant. Maybe this will make it easier. So here's why I take umbrage with the way Ehrman has proposed this, that maybe the book of Acts itself, at least this pericope of Acts 14, is legendary or contains some legend about Paul and Barnabas. What this would require is a Christopher Nolan Inception. Because like Inception, you get, dreams within a dream. What this would take is that it would become a legend within a legend. And I just think that's so highly implausible for that to be the case. That Luke is intentionally trying to hearken back to the poet Ovid. I mean, Luke's purpose is entirely different from being a poet. the genre of Acts is just so different, and it's intentionally historical, like its counterpart, the Gospel of according to Luke. So I just think that's so implausible for Ehrman to suggest that. All right, let's look at model number 2. So again, model number 1, you have when gods temporarily become human. Model 2, divine beings born of a god and immortal. So if you know much of anything of like Hercules, for example, Zeus comes down to earth, has relations with a female human, and bada bing, bada boom, you got Hercules. He is the product of a god and immortal. And so he lists through how there were Greco-Roman figures that were believed to be the case. And there's some interesting things here that I highlighted because, and you see, so first he talks about Alexander the Great was one such figure. But here was what's important from one of the tales. Again, I'm going to mispronounce the name here. The tale of Amphitryon and Alcmena, of course, is a myth in the classical sense. It's a myth. Not just it's fiction, but in the classical genre of myth. And it is not clear that anyone actually believed it. So this is a very relevant distinction that Bart properly makes. That there were myths, and many of the times people recognized them as merely myths. They did not believe in it. They did not actually believe that Hercules was this historical figure born of the god Zeus. They did not actually believe it. And this is a meaningful, significant difference between the Greco-Roman myths, classically speaking, and what those very early Christians came to believe about who Jesus was. Very different. This is probably why C.S. Lewis, comes along and as a ardent student of medieval and certainly classical antiquity, he says that Jesus is the myth made fact. The myth made fact. Third, and the final model, is that a human who becomes divine. This is the third model for how a man could become divine. This would be, think just classic adoptionism for those interested in theology. And then he talks about, again, these Greco-Roman figures. Romulus was the founder of Rome, and he comes to be revered. Then you have the Caesars. You've got Julius Caesar, and you have Caesar Augustus. And these figures, again, they're recognized as only being men, but when they die, then they are sort of elected, voted to be seen as gods. And now in some cases, they were recognized as divinity, as divine, while they were alive. So here's the emperor cult, same sort of thing here on page 31. Let's read this. Normally, the emperor was officially declared a god at his death by a vote of the Roman Senate. This may seem a bit odd to us today, and it is perhaps best to think of the Senate recognizing a divine figure who had been in their midst rather than making someone divine. Now that's interesting, an interesting observation. So they came to think that, well, he had been God all along. It's not as though he had graduated. In some cases, maybe they had graduated, because then you see here Bart does talk about that as well, that one could earn their divinity. So, in terms of where the scholarship is at today, he says, more recent scholarship does not consider worship of the emperor as a top-down act of propaganda by, say, the elites. Rather, it was promoted by Roman officials among the poor dupes who couldn't know any better. It was instead a series of local movements, usually initiated by city officials of the provinces, as a way of revering the power of the empire. Moreover, this worship happened within Rome itself, not simply out in the boonies. Many people quite likely did believe that the emperor was a god, and whether they believed it or not, they certainly treated the emperor as a god. Not only did they perform sacrifices to the other gods on behalf of the emperor, they also performed sacrifices to the emperor as a god, or at least to his genius, or to his numen, the power within him that made him who he was, a divine being. So you do have this emperor cult that exists. I have a sneeze that's coming. Forgive me. All right. So, now, why is it that... and then he has this section on a non-ruler, the passing of Peregrinus. Nice little name there. Peregrinus was basically this philosopher, a cynic philosopher, and there's this satire that talks about his death. So, why is this not all that enticing? So let me talk about this Model 3 where people could earn whether they were a god. Because there's this hierarchy. There's this divine pyramid. And if you're a human, you could get up into that lowest of ranks and be deemed as divine. You wouldn't be up there with Zeus. You wouldn't be up there with Mercury or these other, gods of the pantheon. But you could enter into that first base of the pyramid. Now, observe here what he says about the emperor cult. Many people, top of 41, many people thought these myths were just that, stories, not historical narratives of things that actually happened. People recognized that these were just myths and that there was no reference in history to them. They were just very good stories. Going back a page to 39, this is why I wasn't all that impressed with chapter 1. Apart from Jews in the ancient world, whom I will address in the next chapter, everyone was a polytheist. Everyone was a polytheist. So, there was a belief in many gods, and it was easy for people, well, maybe not easy, but many people could become divine. Last 2 pages here as we go through chapter 1. So he's kind of summarizing his findings here and where he wants to lead us. Let me see if I can get this framed properly. So we've got here, let me move my mouse, blocking the text. Hope that's better. Okay. So this is... on page 44, this is indeed an interesting question because it did indeed happen. What's the question? How did Jesus become God, right? Jesus became God in that major 4th century sense. But he had been seen as God before that by people who did not have this 4th century understanding of the relationship of the human and divine realms. When we talk about earliest Christianity and we ask the question, did Christians think of Jesus as God? We need to rephrase the question slightly so that we ask, in what sense did Christians think of Jesus as God? If the divine realm is a continuum rather than an absolute, a graduated pyramid rather than a single point, then it is the sense in which Jesus is God that's the main issue at the outset. It will become clear in the following chapters that Jesus was not originally considered to be God in any sense at all. Wait a second, what? So here, again, perhaps Ehrman's being a bit sneaky. He's just said that there is a sense in which they believe Jesus was God. And yet, he's going to argue that Jesus was not originally considered to be God in any sense at all. So, again, he says this is in the following chapters. We're not able to analyze, there is no argument here. He's just telling you what he is going to argue. So, what we do have here are interesting tidbits of what Ehrman does believe is true of Jesus. So we get a little picture before he jumps into his arguments about what he did think Jesus claimed. Eventually, Jesus irritated the ruling authorities during a trip he made to Jerusalem, and they had him arrested and tried. He was brought before the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate, and after a short trial he was convicted on charges of political insurgency. He was claiming to be the Jewish king, when only the Roman overlords who were in charge of Palestine and the rest of the Mediterranean could appoint a king. As a political troublemaker, he was condemned to a particularly ignominious death by crucifixion. And as far as the Romans were concerned, that's where his story ended. Now, this is an intriguing statement because there's one way of reading the Gospels that Jesus was not claiming to be a sort of local, earthly Jewish king, at least in the sense that the Jews had hoped for. But that seems to be what's being implied here. He was claiming to be the Jewish king when only the Roman overlords who were in charge. You see, there's one way of reading this to suggest that Jesus claimed he should be in charge and not Pontius Pilate or others. But that's not the way that many of us Christians are reading about Jesus' teaching. And so, this deals with the historical analysis and interpretation of Jesus' words and what his followers believed to be true. Next paragraph, but in fact, that's not where his story ended, and so we return to the driving question of our study. How did an apocalyptic prophet from the backwaters of rural Galilee, crucified for crimes against the state, come to be thought of as equal to the one God Almighty, maker of all things? How did Jesus, in the minds and hearts of his later followers, come to be God? Come to be God. Yes. Brings me back to this point in the introduction. I do not take a stand on the theological question of Jesus' divine status. You can't have your cake and eat it too. It's pretty clear at the outset, after the first chapter, that Bart does in fact already make a claim about Jesus' theological status, aka that he's not actually God because he later came to be considered God, and thus he was just a mere man. So you do have a theological conclusion already being formed by Ehrman. So that's sort of my walkthrough. This is the first time I've done an episode like this. I've got the nice little camera. Next week we'll go through chapter 2, so I can head on back to our PowerPoint here. And let's spin back around. Might even check on how the cubbies are doing. And we will get back here to this chart so you can see here. If you're new to Bart Ehrman's work, you can see here, this is how this liberal scholarship perspective is how he's going to analyze the Gospels and maybe Paul's writings. We'll see. I need to look at the chapter titles. So this chapter 1 was on ancient Greco-Roman views of divine humans. Next week will be divine humans in ancient Judaism. So that'll be a little bit more interesting. It gets us closer to Jewish thinking and what Jews would have thought in that first century. And yeah, so we're certainly looking at the table of contents. We will certainly dig deep into Bible backgrounds, into the Gospels, into what the early Christians thought of Jesus. So I look forward to continuing on with that study. I would be happy to have you join along with me, reading along, sending in questions. Hey, what did you think about this section? So on and so forth. So you might want to read a few days ahead before the Tuesday live streams. That way you can submit your questions and comments for my consideration just slightly in advance for me to think about. So let me turn. I am curious what the Cubbies score is. Padres are up by 1, bottom 3. Okay, well, exciting times for the Cubs in the playoffs this year. Maybe they'll go all the way. Although I'm still very pleased with that 2016 run 9 years ago. That was so much fun. Okay, I'm getting distracted by thinking about baseball. So here we are. We're in this historical Jesus sandbox. If you have questions about how I interpret things in the Gospels, how do I interpret Paul's writings, I'd be happy to entertain even broad questions about the historical Jesus. I should, on next week's episode, I'll try to pull up the fan mail Well, why don't we've got time. I'll see if I can pull it up here. I want to read, we received a very kind message from one of our listeners, Joel. And let's see if I can pull it up on my phone here. Let's see here. As I now struggle to find it. Maybe I can pull it up on my computer here, and I'll just read it aloud for you. Very generous comment from our follower. Okay, and now if Gabe wants to put it up there, we've got it on the screen. Okay, so this is from Joel. So, hello, Kurt Jarris. I would like to submit a fan mail once again to appreciate your work. The first fan feedback I submitted was featured in the Introduction to the Models of Salvation episode. Yes, I'm that same person. We've heard from Joel again. Thank you, Joel, for writing in. And I hope you don't mind that I'm reading your very kind remarks here. As always, I commend your apologetics approach. I like your rule when it comes to engaging on social media. Never say something on social media that you are unwilling to say to a person's face. I believe that you have displayed that admirably. I also must commend you on the general structure of Veracity Hill. The quality of each episode is top-notch. I like the weekly structure. I feel like the time in between the episodes results in good research. Contra to other channels where there is much content. Maybe he means something like sometimes quality drops when you're trying to churn out a bunch of content. Maybe that's what Joel means here. He continues, when I tune into an episode, I am confident it's of good quality. Subsequently, I must say that as a theological channel, you marinating on a given subject matter for months on end. The structure gives ample space for exploring the finer details. As the audience, it's great to be part of the sandbox as well. I would like to thank you for the work that you do. Though your channel is small compared to other similar channels, I feel that yours is a hidden gem. Then he goes on to ask about Divine Counsel, Mike Heiser, which I haven't really gotten into. Right now, I'm just in this sandbox of the historical Jesus. And Joel, thank you so much for your generous comment through our Veracity Hill website. So thank you for sending that kind comment in. So if you have other questions, Joel or any listener, about the historical Jesus, I would be happy to dig into the question that you might be thinking of, or maybe there are questions you're not even aware of, and as we go through this studying Bart Ehrman's book together, something might come to your mind for the first time. For example, I appreciated learning from Bart's book the Acts 14 cultural background of Jupiter and Mercury, and what they allegedly did in Ovid's a narrative, his poem, at Lystra. And so that makes better sense of why the locals interpreted Paul and Barnabas's acts as if they were gods among the people. So it really brought to life why these locals would have thought something so strange. So you gain that deeper understanding, that fuller understanding of the Bible. So that was maybe the most positive thing I drew from chapter 1. I will try to talk about, the best thing I pulled from each chapter. I might also talk about what I think are some of the worst things that I think was the case. For me, I think it was the comparison of Apollonius of Tyana. It's the implication of this copycat occurring. And then, but it's not even really a copycat, because if anybody's copying, it's the story of Apollonius is the copycat. So it doesn't really work. So, I just wasn't really impressed with Bart's argument there. I understand he's just trying to lay this broad socio-context of socio-cultural context for religious views on human divine figures. But I just don't think that there was much there for us to consider. And that is, why would we think that Jesus was only a human? That's what's being implied. And again, to his credit, he does say, hey, in the following chapters, I'm going to argue this, I'm going to argue that. So I look forward to seeing what those arguments are going to be. And so you'll have to tune in next week as we dig into chapter 2 on divine figures in ancient Judaism. Well, that does it for the episode today. I am grateful for the continued support of our patrons. And grateful for the partnerships that we have with our sponsors. They are Defenders Media, Apologetics 315, and Rethinking Hell. I want to thank the team at Defenders Media for all the fine work that they do week in, week out. Our technical producer for the show, Gabe. We've got a graphic artist, Kyle. We've got content development with Beth. And we've got a communications associate with Mark. He helps post the episodes at the website. We have Sophia helping with events and operations. And we've got Kevin doing coding work and Peter doing some fundraising for us. It really is a nice team that we have at Defenders, and I'm grateful for working with each and every one of them. And I also want to thank Bart. He is our author guest over the next couple months. I've sent him an email. Hopefully we can get him on the show and we'll have a discussion over his book. I think that would be nice. But maybe we'll wait a little bit as I can work through the chapters. Last but certainly not least, I want to thank you for listening in or for watching as we're striving for truth on Ehrman's How Jesus Became God.
This has been Veracity Hill, a viewer and listener supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.